this is pretty tragic, just this one historical traumatic tragedy that happened to our people. It was very, very traumatic. So it resulted in this interrupted journey. So the stages of life are still there. We still come from the spirit world, but there isn't, a lot of times there isn't, those ceremonies aren't held for the development of the baby. And in fact, a lot of our young women might be in relationships that are abusive. So the infant in the womb is already experiencing trauma while in the womb. And when she might not even have a home, she might be going from, home to home, relative to relative, or friends' houses. So she has this feeling of, not having any kind of roots or a sense of belonging. And the baby feels that too, So whenever baby comes to earth, then the first person to touch the baby and the first voice they hear, is usually the medical, people. And they have a responsibility to make sure there's a safe delivery, that the baby is, protected and the mother is protected and all of that. But they don't have the responsibility to pray with the baby, to welcome the baby, to do the ceremony, the wiping of the mouth ceremony. They don't have that responsibility. So it's absent, from that birthing process. So whenever she leaves from the hospital with the baby, she's still doesn't have a home. And I'm just using an example, a fictional example. I'm not referring to anybody. So whenever she leaves from there, then baby is irritable, cries all the time. And because she's young, doesn't have the support, she gets overwhelmed and she starts to hit the baby. And so Child Protection Services steps in, takes the baby. So look at how many interruptions to this journey that this baby already has had, which is, in the womb, like whenever his mother or her mother got abused or beaten, then he or she felt that too. So the being irritable and crying all the time, even if they're not hungry or they're dry, they're still very irritable and hard to soothe, then that they're expressing something, within their spirit. So the interruptions include, being taken from his or her mother and then maybe being placed in foster care. Maybe there's trauma that happens in foster care, because it is a reality. So by the time this baby is 3 years old, he or she has had so many interruptions to their journey, and that little squiggly line there represents the interruption to their spirit growth also, So that first stage of life is characterized by feeling scared, alone, not feeling confident, because again, those ceremonies aren't being done. They're being, like the earmarking ceremony, the naming ceremony, the celebration ceremonies. So what happens is they're growing physically, mentally, but emotionally and spiritually, they're still at that stage. So you'll see, people, adults, like maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, having childlike reactions to stressors. So like, say, shutting down, silent treatment. That's what children do. Whenever they can't cope with something, they'll shut down and they won't talk, or they'll have a temper tantrum. And we see that in adults, where they'll get violent and they'll have a temper tantrum, in response to some kind of a stressor. So whenever that's, seen or experienced, then what we have to ask is not what's wrong with that person, but what happened to that person, back when, what didn't get addressed, So we really have to, think about that in terms of, whenever we're helping our relatives to, and I'm not trying to excuse behavior, but to provide kind of like an explanation, that for, what is the root of that? And we'll talk about the root, the hutka, at a later time. But so this first stage of life is, again, like I said, characterized by not feeling safe, not being secure, maybe being abandoned, maybe being abused. So their the impact to their mental, emotional, spiritual, and often physical growth is really impacted. So by the time they get to the age of transition, there's no ceremony there. There's no Ishnatia Wichamampi, there's no Wichasha Inhunipi, and they start to feel overwhelmed. So the overwhelming feeling can manifest in cutting on themselves. Like we see a lot of our young girls, particularly young girls, but I've seen them on boys too, cuts on their arms and some, even if you don't see it on their arms, and I know of where they cut on their legs. So, their jeans hide it, or on their stomach, and their blouse or their shirt hides it. But so we can't assume that they're not cutting if we don't see it on their arms. But that's an expression of, that overwhelming feeling of, what am I going to do with this? This I can't get away from it. And so they turn it on themselves, or they might turn it on others, where they get violent and they break things, or they destroy property, or a lot of different expressions. So that transitional teaching, those ceremonies aren't done, so they don't have the direction, they don't have the guidance that they need to, go forward, in life. And many of them tragically, will choose to end their life, or attempt to end their life. So we have, one of the highest suicide rates in the country, among Native youth, from around 13, 14 to, up to 24 in that age group. Then we have a really high suicide rate. So if that second stage of life is, if they survive that, then and go into the third stage, then what we're seeing is people living on the streets, a lot of relatives, wandering on the streets. We see a lot of alcoholism, drug addiction. We see a lot of our relatives in prison. And if, that isn't present, or maybe it is, and, then we see a lot of our male relatives dying at a young age, between the age of 45 and 50, and our female relatives dying in their early 50s. And so what that means for that fourth stage of life is very few elders. I won't say no elders, like this slide says, but very few elders to pass on the teachings, to keep social order, to observe custom law, to keep spiritual order. And the opposite of order is disorder. It's chaos, confusion, and that translates into all of the negative statistics that we have as a people. So the return to the spirit world might be characterized by illness, by traumatic death, accidents, those kinds of things. It's not a calm, peaceful transition. So look at the bottom of the slide. One big contributing factor is that the Wotakuya, the kinship system, is weakened, in contemporary Lakota society. So if you were to go into Walmart and you would say to another Lakota person, like say, if I happen to pass a male about my age, Lakota male, and say, hello, Shicheshi. See, Shicheshi is the term for how a female addresses a male cousin. And even if we're not related by blood, even if he's not related by, he's not a cousin by blood, then our way at one time was to use those kinship terms and to treat and address each other as, relatives. So if I went into Walmart today and I said, hello, Shijeshi, a man maybe about my age, then he might look at me with a confused look, and he might, say to, his partner or whoever he's with, who is that woman? Why is she calling me that? I wonder if I'm related to her. So it's sad, but it's true that we become disconnected from that wotakuya, that worldview of we are relatives, and it's been weakened. So whenever that infrastructure isn't there, then it gives us permission to treat each other any way that we want to. So it's real important to strengthen that, that foundation of wotakuya, kinship. And one way to do that is to start using the kinship terms. So in this Lakota mental health model, Lakota mental health first aid, then that is one of the principles, wotakuya, is use the kinship terms. Look at them as relatives rather than clients, rather than patients, rather than cases or files, because again, that will objectify them. That will put them into a category of their objects, their cases. So I think it's real. It's how would you say? It's a responsibility, that to do that, to reconnect to that, because what we're saying to these young people whenever we use kinship terms with them is we're saying you belong, you belong to this, to the Lakota kinship circle. That's why you're Takoja to me, or that's why you're Toja or Toshka. And it also establishes respect, and then establish boundaries also, So that's one basic thing that we can, basic action item that we can all, those of us that choose to, can revive or give action, to that teaching by using the kinship terms. And then we'll start strengthening that, foundation again, of Lakota society.